In the previous tutorial, I used the mod wheel, generating CC1 messages, to impart dynamics and expressive changes to string and brass sounds, though as an aside, some composers like to use a foot pedal for that kind of thing. And I also showed how controller messages can be drawn in right in a MIDI editor. But in this tutorial, I'm going to introduce you to the highly expressive nature of another method for generating CC messages, the breath controller, as demonstrated in a little jazz piece of mine for a change of pace, and featuring a sample modeling Harmon Mute trumpet sound as performed by LA composer, big band arranger, and in his spare time breath controller virtuoso, Dan Radlauer. Dan performed the trumpet part by playing notes on his keyboard controller while blowing into a breath controller to control dynamics and impart expression. The breath controller generates CC2 messages, which the plugin responds to by altering the volume and timbre of the sound. The degree of expression and dynamics, I think you'll have to agree, are really quite stunning. Of course, the expression itself comes from Dan's artistry as a performer and his mastery of breath controller technique, but let's take a look at what's going on from a technical point of view. First, I should mention that the breath controller works by generating CC2 messages which increase in value the harder one blows into the unit. And like all MIDI CC messages, the available range of values is 0 to 127. So, what you're looking at here are two excerpts from the recorded MIDI performance showing notes and CC2 curves at the beginning of two of the phrases. And I want to point out two things. First, notice how the CC2 values ramp up before Dan played the notes. And this shows us that he anticipated playing the notes on the keyboard by blowing into the breath controller to get some air pressure built up. But then notice how the CC2 values continue to ramp up after he played the notes. So the beginnings or attacks of the notes are actually little mini crescendos. And it's this momentary blooming of the sound at the beginning of the note that's very characteristic of woodwind and brass instruments. And we can see it in audio recordings of clarinet, the attack characteristics show up even more clearly in this recording of trumpet, and though it's not as obvious in this recording of English horn, we can still hear it very clearly by way of its characteristic paw, paw, paw kind of attack character. So here we can see that the CC2 messages generated by Dan's breath controller performance in effect mapped his air pressure, and we can see how the attack of his air pressure is a little bit characteristically slow against the notes. And that makes the breath controller a perfect candidate for playing woodwind and brass sounds, but not so much string sounds. Every once in a while I'll hear a mock-up where it's obvious to me that the composer used a breath controller to try to impart dynamics to strings, but the strings almost end up having sort of a tooting or blowing kind of attack that really isn't characteristic of string instruments. And in closing, I just wanted to mention that if you don't have a breath controller, you can still play the sample modeling instruments or any other virtual instrument that utilizes breath controller for expression by performing CC2 from a slider or knob or even a foot pedal that outputs CC2 messages. You may not get as spontaneous a performance as when playing on a breath controller or an EWI, but the instruments will still work just fine.